The war in Ukraine has pushed up the price of oil to a 10-year high. With Russia under sanctions, prices could continue to go higher. So how will the world deal with this energy crisis? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the program. I'm Hazem, Sika. As the Russian invasion of Ukraine enters its second week, crude oil prices have risen to levels not seen in a decade. Russia is the world's third largest oil producer and provider of nearly 40% of Europe's energy supplies, prompting many to look for alternatives. Now, big energy consumers are boycotting Russian crude, collapsing their demand as they shun the country's market. Energy markets have largely been spared from the sanctions Western countries placed on Russia's financial sector, knowing how important energy is to their own economies. Now, despite the rise in prices, OPEC and other oil-producing countries said they are sticking with their plan to gradually increase oil production. Meanwhile, nations, including the US, have agreed to release 60 million barrels of crude oil reserves. It is hoped the increase in supply will curb oil prices after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. The price of crude is expected to hit more than $120 a barrel this weekend, and the increase is already causing long queues at pumps in some regions of the world. Now, EU energy ministers say they want to speed up their transition to clean energy sources.
Europe can cope in the event that there is a cut in the supply of gas or oil from Russia. We can do it immediately. However, we will have to look in the medium term at how to build new stocks for next winter, by first looking at how to diversify our supply, then by replacing our strategic stocks again and using our strategic stocks, but also by generally increasing our imports.
We are 4 to 6% dependent on Russian gas, 30% dependent on Russian oil, and 20% dependent on Russian uranium. So it's clear that if we want to eliminate this dependency, we will have to accelerate our energy transition, heat our homes differently, and generate our electricity differently.
The most important agenda point is our support to Ukraine. In this perspective, I expect that energy ministers will support the emergency synchronization of Ukraine power grid with European grid as soon as possible. I believe that this is the only possibility at current circumstances.
Well, let's get the thoughts of our guests now. Joining us from London is Alex Schindelar, President of Energy Intelligence and the former editor of Petroleum Intelligence Weekly. In Oslo, we have Bjarne Schieldrop, a specialist on European energy politics. And joining us from Washington, Ben Cahill, Senior Fellow at the Energy, Security and Climate Change Program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Good to have you all with us. So, Alex Schindelar, if I could start with you then. What sort of implications is all of this having for the Russian economy, first of all, the longer this goes on?
Well, thanks for having me on. I mean, the impact on the Russian economy is already beginning to be felt. As you said in the opening parts, the sanctions have excluded energy for the moment, which is a large chunk of the Russian budget. But we already know that ordinary Russians and very wealthy Russians are being hit by these sanctions, by the devaluation of the ruble, by the problems with the stock market. So there's no doubt that these sanctions are being felt in Russia, both by the government and by ordinary people.
Bjarne Schieldrop, we mentioned there how dependent so many European countries are on Russian energy, and there had been quite an uneasiness about that before this conflict started. This has now forced them to rethink things a lot more quickly now, hasn't it?
Absolutely. I mean, if you look back over the past 20, 30 years, the idea was that Europe, the Western Europe, should go hand in hand together with Russia into the future. We should buy energy from Russia and they would get money from us. Happy marriage. And that marriage is now broken totally. And we saw like a 180-degree turn by Germany last week from long-term supporter of importing Russian energy. Suddenly they just turned around and say, Now we're going to build LNG import terminals. They have none today. We're going to move away from this energy marriage with Russia. And of course, we have a huge reliance on energy from Russia today in Western Europe. So we cannot really break the marriage apart quite yet, but I think the divorce is clear. And, this is going to accelerate Western Europe's path towards renewable energy, electric vehicles, and less dependent, especially on Russian fossil fuels.
Ben Cahill, how much damage could this do to the world economy? Because with the economic sanctions that we've seen so far from the United States and from their partners in Europe, we've seen them kind of pull their punches a bit when it comes to energy, because they know how much it could affect them, the economic blowback of this on them potentially. So what is the impact of this going forward? And if things don't change, could they rethink that strategy of not doing anything to upset the energy markets at this point?
The economic stakes are really high. I mean, this is one of the biggest energy disruptions that we've seen since the oil shocks of the 70s. And the backdrop of this, of course, is that in the United States and in a lot of Western economies, we've had inflation, we've had pretty serious price run-ups. Commodity prices have been rising for the last 6 months as a result of this really rapid rebound in commodity demand for oil, natural gas, and other products with the rebound from COVID-19. And I think it's taken governments by surprise. It's a big political liability for the Biden administration and others. It's a huge economic challenge to deal with it. And even before this past week with the war, things were getting difficult to manage from a political perspective. But here in Washington, the concern is always about gasoline prices and how presidents can manage that. The reality is that if you're in the White House, you don't have great options to deal with rising energy prices. And the latest conflict, the war that Russia has entered into with Ukraine has just kind of turbocharged all these concerns.
Alex Schindler, if I could turn back to you on this. I put this question to Bjarne earlier, but is this going to speed up efforts to diversify energy dependence from a lot of countries?
Well, I think what we've heard is that many European leaders would like it to, and they're going to make efforts to do it. I think the important thing to note is the bigger picture here. While in the short term, the ability to get Europe not dependent on Russia is not possible in the short term. But the bigger picture here, what we're witnessing is a division between Europe and Russia, and I think, as the previous guest said, or the previous speaker said, a break in this marriage. And so Europe has got to find other alternatives. They're making decisions right now that will force them to do so. So whether they're going to be able to find alternative gas supplies from other places, they're 40% dependent on Russian gas, whether they're going to find rethink their nuclear stance, as there's been some indication that some countries are doing, or whether they're going to try to speed up the transition to a lower carbon economy by rushing through renewables and other new energy sources. This is the longer term direction of travel, but I would 100% agree this is not going to be possible to do right away. So it will be tough in the short term to deal with the disruption if Russian energy no longer flows to Europe.
Beyond Schieldrop, how bad could this get for you? Because history has shown that whenever there's been a large spike in oil prices, not long after that, there's been quite a large recession.
Yeah, I think, that it's increasing risk that this is going to have an extremely negative fallout for the global economy, and especially for the European economy. And if you look at natural gas prices right now, in Europe, they are trading at equivalent of $300 per barrel of oil equivalent versus normal 35 to 40, right? So we are talking 8, 9, 10 times the normal price in Europe, with also high prices in Asia for natural gas. And of course, the market is pricing that these prices are going to be where they are now at 300 all through the year until the Q1. I think that is totally unsustainable. This is breaking demand down, and prices will have to fall back. And of course, when you break demand, you basically essentially break the economy. And of course, it's not just natural gas, but it's also coal prices are 5 times higher than normal. They increased 50% yesterday. Not just for the front end, but also for December contract later this year. So, you know, it's rippling and cascading through the global economy. And we use so much energy for so many things, and everything will go increasing in cost. Industrial metals are moving straight up due to the increased cost, but also agricultural products are moving straight up the ladder with the highest price ever in nominal terms for the agricultural product index of Bloomberg.
Ben Cahill, how bad could this get for the U.S. economy the longer this goes on? You mentioned, you know, higher prices at the pumps. That's going to affect many Americans more directly. But the longer, with the other problems that the U.S. economy and other economies are facing right now with inflation and trying to recover from the long pandemic, the effects of that. How bad could this get the longer this goes on for America?
I think inflation is an economy-wide problem in the United States, not just in the energy sector, but for all kinds of goods. You go out to dinner, you see the price of food is increased. The cost of everything seems to be going up. I think this is the #1 political challenge for the White House, and energy is a huge part of it. You know, consumer prices are increasing around 7.5% a month. Most of us have never seen this kind of inflation in our lifetimes. And, you know, the old adage about gasoline prices is that people feel it every time they fill the pump because they see the numbers and they see them ticking up. It's a very visible sign of the inflation that they feel all around them. So the White House is really keenly focused on this. It's been a huge challenge for them since the fall. We saw that the White House started to experiment with, you know, using the Strategic Petroleum Reserve last November to try to put more barrels on the market, cool the market. It's talked over and over again about trying to have dialogue with OPEC and the other oil producers to encourage them to ramp up production. And the reality is, you know, this is a White House that I think doesn't really want to talk about oil. They want to talk about the energy transition. They want to talk about pushing that forward. But energy security issues have come back in a big way in the past 6 months. And so they're trying to keep their eyes on the horizon with the longer term energy transition issues that they care so passionately about, trying to push those forward. But the reality of the market is intervening. Things, of course, have gotten much worse in the last week.
Alex Schindelar, we mentioned at the top there how OPEC, for now, is going to stick to its current policy of not opening up the taps further to try and bring the pressure down and increase supply and thereby hopefully lower the prices. What's the thinking behind that, and what are the kind of geopolitical implications as well with the Biden administration?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think as many viewers may know, we had a meeting of OPEC this week. They decided to have a very quick meeting and basically keep production policy the same. Now, the thinking as we understand it is they really didn't think there's much value in adding additional oil to this market. And because from their view, a lot of the sort of froth in the price is coming from the geopolitical premium from this war and their experience, and there's a lot of experienced people that are leading OPEC countries now, tells them that adding additional barrels in a market that's facing a crisis is not always the recipe to kind of bring prices down. To get to Ben's point to reducing prices at the pump, that often is not a correlation there, especially in the middle of a crisis. So they felt, first of all, there wasn't much point in adding additional barrels. They also, and it's important to point out, Russia is a key member of the OPEC alliance that's been managing markets for a number of years now. And they also did not want to get into the discussion with Russia or other member states about whether it's appropriate to be raising or changing output right now, because once you start talking about it, it starts getting complicated. And they did not want to be part of the story. So the strategy was quick continuation of policy was already announced, get it over with, and don't become the story, because they do not want to become part of this giant story that's sort of dominating headlines right now, which is the Ukraine war.
Bjarne Schieldrop, is there a fear as well that by increasing supply right now, it could come back to bite them, in that later on you'll get a glut in the markets and that'll bring oil prices too low that they like?
Right. I mean, if we look at the Brent crude oil spot price today, it traded as high as $127 per barrel. And I think this, of course, oil prices hitting wide across the world for consumers everywhere, while nat gas prices so far are hitting predominantly Asian and European consumers. And I think, versus historical levels, demand destruction for oil is starting to bite from $120 to $150 per barrel. So we're starting to make destruction on the demand side with current oil prices. And I think OPEC would very much like to avoid a boom and then a bust. They would like to avoid that current spike in energy and metals and agriculture prices basically tips the global economy into recession. So I think, yes, Russia and Saudi Arabia have a very, very important relationship, and Saudi is very reluctant to step in and meddle in the whole thing and add more barrels in the middle of the crisis. But, if oil price continues to 130, 140, 150, I think the equation becomes slightly different, because then the risk of recession really increases significantly. And these boom-bust cycles is not really what you want as an oil producer. They really would like to be more stable, but avoiding these boom-busts. So that could change the equation a little bit.
Ben Cahill, what's your view on that?
I think it's a tough position for OPEC Plus to be in, right? Their stated goal is to avoid volatility in the market, as Bjarne said. And the backdrop of this is that spare capacity within the group is pretty limited. If we take a step back, in April of 2020, OPEC Plus made the biggest production cuts ever. They responded to the price crash that happened, all the concerns after COVID-19. They cut 9.7 million barrels a day from the market. Ever since, month by month, they've been adding barrels in. And what they've said is that they're helping to balance supply and demand. They don't want to move too quickly and put too many barrels onto the market. They do see some potential downside risks. The issue here is that as they've added more oil onto the market each month, the wedge of available spare capacity has gotten smaller and smaller. And in a tight market like this, with a lot of concerns about low inventories, pretty strong demand, people are worried about low spare capacity. So in addition to the question of whether or not it would really help in the market to put barrels on, it's kind of a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation. If they put more barrels onto the market and diminish spare capacity, it could backfire in some ways. So my read on the meeting this week is that they needed a little bit more time to digest what was happening and the scale of the disruption from Russia before they take action. I think another thing at the back of their minds is that we could have an Iran deal happen at some point very soon. And that would have a real material impact on balances looking out for the rest of this year. So yeah. I think there are some benefits. Wait, see how this unfolds, and then maybe come back and make a decision together at some point soon.
Yeah, let's put that to Alex Schindelar. I mean, Ben Cahill there was talking about if there's a possibility of reviving the 2015 Iran nuclear deal, and the potential of bringing Iran back into the oil market. What effect could that have?
Well, it would have a major effect. And so what we are hearing is that we are quite close to a deal being agreed between the U.S. And Western powers and Iran to reinstate the nuclear deal that former President Donald Trump walked away from. And this would be a significant addition of oil to the market. From what we understand at the OPEC meeting, this was not a point of discussion. Really, they kind of just wanted to get it finished as soon as possible, not discuss very much at all. And their policy is they don't really talk about what's going to happen in the future. But a return of Iran, at least from a sentiment point of view, even the understanding that Iran barrels are coming back to the market, depending on how quickly they can actually do it, would potentially counteract some of that sort of froth we're seeing in the market, which is getting quite significant. Now, I think we have to remember that it's going to take months to bring any Iranian production back. I think the Iranians hope that they can move and add about 1 to 1.5 million barrels a day over the next couple of months after the deal is agreed and everything is signed off. Our experience with that is that's sometimes optimistic, doesn't quite all come back at that time. So while the announcement of a deal would be, from a sentiment point of view, potentially something that can counteract the higher oil prices, from a physical supply point of view, I think people shouldn't get too excited about this actually changing the equation of what we're talking about here. Because as Ben says, there's not quite enough oil to sort of fill this market. And the extra barrels that OPEC can bring, are getting smaller and smaller.
Bjarne Schieldrop, a lot of people have been saying that the war in Ukraine may have a limited impact on the global economy right now because trade links with Russia and the rest of the world were limited to begin with Russia accounting for something like 1.5% of global GDP. So with that in mind, then, what potential impact do you think there could be both on Russia's economy and the rest of the world?
Well, I mean, as long as energy prices are low, we tend to forget that it matters, right? It's kind of off the chart, out of mind, and we don't notice how incredibly important energy and food is before prices start to rise significantly. And of course, Russia is massively important for the global energy market, especially for European and general for the global market. But must also remember that Russia is a very large exporter of aluminum, and palladium, and nickel, and a lot of other resources as well. And not to forget, Russia is the biggest #1 wheat exporter in the world, and Ukraine is number 5. And together, Russia and Ukraine export more wheat from the so-called breadbasket, Black Earth, Black Sea region. They are bigger together than United States and Canada together. So, when it really shit hits the fan and you really want energy, you want food, of course, Russia is massively important. Just a short comment on crude barrels from OPEC plus. What we see here is a squeeze that started in the natural gas market with light molecules, and this typically has cascaded into a tight market for light sweet crude, typically Brent crude and WTI, and the crude that OPEC plus typically have and that Russia also typically has is medium heavy and sour crude. So this is not the biggest shortage. The biggest shortage is in the light end of the spectrum for light sweet crude, and that is leading the rally. But of course, now we're losing something like 1 to 2 million barrels per day from Russia in terms of crude oil, medium sour crude, and that is of course tightening up that part of the market, which of course the rest of OPEC plus could help to alleviate. So that would be good. But right now it's an exporter strike in terms of crude barrels out of Russia, it seems, with shippers not wanting to take the cargoes, refineries not wanting to take the oil. So even if oil and energy is not sanctioned for exports out of Russia, in practical terms, we actually see a sharp reduction of flows of both coal and oil out of Western Russian ports.
Ben Cahill, Bjarne mentioned there the impact of wheat on wheat supply. So beyond oil, we look at other commodities like wheat, which, as was said, Russia and Ukraine are large suppliers of. What implications or what impact could that have on the global markets?
I think Bjarne makes a good point that Russia is often thought of as an exporter of oil and gas, but in fact they export a lot of metals and agricultural commodities too. And so does Ukraine, by the way. They're both big exporters of wheat. I think it adds to the inflationary concerns that we see around the world. We've already had rising food prices in a lot of places. You've got regions like the Middle East that are quite dependent on grain imports. So it's going to add to some of that economic pressure. And just to back up something that Bjarne said, I mean, I think when we look at the shortages today, we see an immediate impact with crude, but some of these other commodities are raw inputs and kind of base materials that are used in manufacturing and lots of other things. So the impact and the potential price impact, we're not going to see it necessarily today. It will continue to unfold over a couple of months.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you to all three of you, Alex Schindelar, Bjarne Schieldrop, and Ben Cahill. Thanks very much for being on Inside Story. And thank you, as always, for watching. Remember, you can see this program again anytime. Just go to our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle there is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Hazem, Sika, and the whole team here in Doha, bye for now.